Welcome back to the Owner Podcast. My name is Dion, and in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the 80-20 rule, except for property. It's property related, and we're going to discuss that because really, we sometimes focus on 80% when 20% is really what actually matters. But anyway, let's just discuss. The 80-20 rule, if you haven't heard, is that roughly 80% of outcomes result from 20% of causes. And I've sort of adjusted it just to sort of work conveniently for this podcast. So we're going to be discussing that really only 20% of what people actually sort of consider actually matters when it comes to a property. And might I add, this is coming out in mid-December. So this is actually our last podcast for this year, which has been our first year. And we are going to be taking a bit of a break. As I discussed a couple episodes ago, we're going to try and revamp the podcast next year. More guests, more investment from my perspective. And I really want to sort of grow this next year into something that's bigger and better. And I'm really excited from that. So yeah, have a good Christmas. Have a fantastic New Year's. Enjoy some time off and spend it with family. But to conclude this year, we're going to be discussing sort of the 80-20 rule, but adjusted to suit for us. 20% of a property determines 80% of the long-term value, sort of in my opinion. And there's 20% of the property that I would consider sort of non-negotiables. And often the other 80% are things that are just nice to have. So things like tapware, renovations, cosmetic things, all those things in a property can be changed. But there's things that just can't be. Location, block size, the sort of the block dimensions as well. And quite often the asset class as well. Like if you buy an apartment, unfortunately, hate to break it to you, it's never going to become a house. So there's things that you cannot change when it comes to property. And that's what you should be focusing on. You shouldn't be focusing so much on all the nice to haves. Now, yes, there are buyers that will go buy, and when they're buying, they're like, I'm looking for a fully renovated house or a brand new house. Yes, that's great, but you still have to focus on the fundamentals. And that's what's really important when it comes to sort of 20% of the property determines 80% of the long-term value. The reality is all the cosmetic stuff are ultimately depreciating and are ultimately taste. And everyone's taste is different. So let's discuss some things that are really important for long-term growth. Let's discuss the 20%, which is responsible for the 80. That 20%, the non-negotiables, location. How good is location? Last episode, we talked about like train tracks, main roads, schools, power lines. So location, you can't change it. So if you want good growth, don't compromise on your location. All right. You're better off moving out a suburb, in my opinion, and being in a better spot than being in the worst spot in a good suburb. Because I reckon you'll get better growth from emotional buyers that are prepared to pay a higher price. The floor plan and the natural light are really important as well. How good is the natural light? How good is the floor plan? Because it's not easy to change. You can change it, but these are harder things to change. You're going to require more investment up front. The structural integrity as well of a property is really important. Again, like if you're going to have to tip a whole bunch of money into a property, that's never ideal. But location, asset selection, land size, block dimension, those things are the real fundamentals on things you can't compromise on. But what can you compromise on? Well, painting, carpets, floorboards. You can do a kitchen, you can do a bathroom. If you're buying solely for growth, and that's a massive that's massively important in terms of your criteria for what you buy, those things you can change. Again, in the last episode, we spoke about those are opportunities. Those are opportunities for you to add value. But there's no perfect property. And I think that's also really important to talk about. There's never the property that you walk through and it's absolutely perfect. And if you do find that property, guess what? The price is probably not perfect. The only time you don't make a compromise is when price is a compromise. And most of us don't have limitless budgets. And so it's really important for us to not get caught up on the 80% that don't determine the long-term value of a property. Yes, a renovated property is going to be more expensive and perform, it'll sell for a higher price, but it's all relative. You're buying it for more. So again, like you've got to look at the 80% as potential opportunity as well. Now, that's not saying you have to buy a property where the 20% is absolutely perfect and the 80% is awful because you're buying, only for growth, but there's finding that balance where you might find 20% is great and 40% of the remaining 80s, that's fine, but you're not making your decision based on that. And that's where so many buyers are just struggle with making compromise because they're not sure where to compromise. But don't compromise on the 20. Don't compromise on the 20% that's going to give you 80% of your growth. Because if you compromise on that, that's when you own a property for 10 years and you go to sell it and you don't sell it for a good price. That compromise would be like buying an off-the-plan apartment, right? That's the compromise. You want to buy something that's brand new, shiny, has all the appliances, it has everything. It's got pools, all these nice amenities. It's got shops underneath it. That's great, but that 80% isn't responsible for the growth. So that's compromising on all the non-negotiables when it comes to a property that grows well. And so that's an example of something you shouldn't buy. And if you look at off-the-plan apartments, they're one of the most risky things you can buy. I mean, most of them lose money. 50% of apartments that sell in CBD don't sell for a profit. If anything, they lose money for their owners. And so again, that's an example of when you buy purely for the other 80% that you shouldn't be focusing on. As I said, not every buyer is going to be focusing only on 20% and who cares about the other 80, but it's about striking that balance. Don't be 100%, on the 80%. Just come into it sort of a little bit more open and be prepared to make some compromise, but the right compromise. So I sort of hope that helps. Gives you a bit of an illustration of sort of what to buy and what not to buy. I know this isn't a long episode. This one's sort of just wrapping it up for the year because I feel like we've covered off on most things. I feel like this year we've really discussed a lot. I would love some additional questions. Like if people are listening in, questions actually help grow this podcast as well. It gives us things to discuss. You can jump across to our Instagram, Own It Podcast. And if you jump across to our Instagram and send us a DM, we can answer any questions you have. And any feedback would be appreciated. Like if you came across our Insta and gave us some feedback, we would greatly appreciate that too. Potentially things you'd like to see next year in 2026 on the podcast. Some guests potentially you would like to hear from as well. We can cater for that if you let us know. And of course, wrapping it up for the year, if you would like to leave us a review, that would massively help the podcast. Most people that listen don't leave a review, and that helps us sort of give more information and make our industry more transparent, an industry that's not very transparent. So if you had 60 seconds, please hit the 5 stars. You can rate us less, but we would really appreciate a 5-star review. Have a great Christmas. Have a great New Year's. And we are so excited to catch you in 2026 for a new revamped version of the Own It podcast. We'll catch you then. Be safe.